Back in 2007, Fox took a look at a pilot for an animated comedy and concluded it was simply too offensive to broadcast. The pilot was called Brickleberry. The very same network that, at that exact moment, was running Family Guy on Sunday nights had decided this other show had stepped over a line its own flagship had never crossed. Brickleberry would eventually land at Comedy Central 5 years afterward, run for 3 seasons, and then vanish. Hardly anyone remembers it today. That episode is one of roughly a dozen like it from the oddest 15-year stretch in the history of American adult animation. After Family Guy clawed its way back from cancellation in 2005, every network in the industry spent the following 2 decades trying to construct its own version of it. Nearly all of them fell flat. A few failed so completely that the networks scrubbed the shows off the internet altogether. Tonight, we work through every single one of them. Welcome to Sleepy Broadcast. Let's get started. The conditions that created the wave. Family Guy's 2005 resurrection and the adult animation gold rush. Before any of the shows in this piece could exist, something truly strange had to occur first. A show had to die, get buried, and then crawl back out of the grave. Family Guy debuted on Fox on January 31st, 1999, straight after the Super Bowl. That is the kind of slot a network hands you only when it believes it has a hit in its hands, and Fox was not wrong to believe it. Seth MacFarlane was 25 years old when the show went on the air. He had pitched the original concept as a 15-minute pilot back in 1998, building it around a reworked version of 2 cartoon shorts he had made earlier in his career called The Life of Larry and Steve. Larry turned into Peter, Steve the dog turned into Brian, and the Griffin family of Quahog, Rhode Island, walked into American living rooms during the highest-rated television event of the year. The show did not stay there. Ratings fell off quickly. Fox shuffled Family Guy around the schedule, which is exactly what networks do when they have stopped believing in something but have not quite decided to let it go. The show was yanked off the air during its 2nd season because of sliding numbers. It returned. It was canceled again in 2002 once the 3rd season wrapped. By every standard measure of how television functions, Family Guy was finished. The writers had moved on. The voice cast had moved on. Seth MacFarlane was busy with what was supposed to be his next project. Then 3 things happened that nobody saw coming, and the entire history of adult animation across the 2000s and 2010s flows directly out of those 3 things. So, before naming a single imitator, those 3 things have to be laid on the table. The first was Adult Swim. Cartoon Network had launched its late-night block for grown-ups in 2001, aimed at the sort of viewer who was still awake at midnight and wanted something funnier and stranger than what the broadcast networks were serving up. Adult Swim began airing Family Guy reruns in April 2003, dropped them into a late-night slot, and watched what would happen. What happened was that Family Guy instantly became the highest-rated show on the entire block. Viewership in that time slot climbed by more than 200%. People who had never watched the show during its original Fox run were discovering it for the first time at 1 in the morning, recommending it to their friends, and coming back the next night for more. The second was DVD sales. The 1st and 2nd seasons of Family Guy hit DVD the same week the Adult Swim reruns began, which was either a miracle of timing or the single smartest piece of marketing of the decade. Within 1 month, that DVD set sold 400,000 copies. By the end of the year, it had sold over 2 million. That made it the best-selling television DVD release of 2003 and the 2nd best-selling television DVD ever produced up to that point. Only the 1st season of Chappelle's Show had sold more. The 3rd season DVD release, which came later, sold over 1 million copies on its own. The third thing was the arithmetic those numbers did to Fox's executives. A show they had canceled was now outselling shows they still had on the air. A show they had given up on was the most watched program on a rival network's overnight block. The DVDs alone were pulling in more revenue than most of the new shows on the Fox schedule. So, in May 2004, Fox did something that had never been done before in the history of American television. They ordered new episodes of a show specifically because of how well its old episodes were selling on DVD. 35 new episodes. Family Guy was coming back, not because the network wanted it back, but because the audience had refused to let it go. Those new episodes started airing on May 1st, 2005. That date matters more than almost any other date in this piece. May 1st, 2005 was the launch night of Animation Domination, Fox's new Sunday evening block given over entirely to adult animated comedy. Family Guy came back that night. American Dad, MacFarlane's second show, premiered that night. The Simpsons was already there. King of the Hill was already there. For the first time, an entire primetime block on a major broadcast network was handed over to grown-up cartoons, and the whole structure had been built around the surprise return of a show that was supposed to be dead. This is the part most people never realize about the next 15 years of cartoon history. Animation Domination was not a programming experiment. It was a money-printing machine. Family Guy in particular became something Fox had never had before. An adult cartoon that pulled in the 18 to 49-year-old viewer advertisers paid the most to reach, and pulled them in week after week in numbers that could go toe-to-toe with any live-action sitcom on television. The show was a hit. The block was a hit. The DVDs kept selling. The merchandise kept selling. Stewie Griffin turned up on lunchboxes and t-shirts and dorm room posters from coast to coast. And every other network in the business looked at all that and asked the same question. How do we get one of those? This is where the gold rush begins. Because once Animation Domination proved that adult animation could be a serious business, every executive at every network with a development budget started hunting for their own version. Some went looking for their own Family Guy. Some went looking for their own Seth MacFarlane. Some simply tried to copy the formula and hoped the audience would not notice the difference. The following years would produce more new adult animated sitcoms than any comparable stretch of American television history, and most of them would fail. But before anyone could fail, the formula itself had to be understood, because if you cannot name what you are copying, you cannot copy it. So, what exactly was Family Guy doing that made it so dependable as a hit? 3 things, and these 3 things will surface in every section of this piece, so they are worth knowing now. The first was the cutaway gag. Family Guy did not invent the cutaway. The technique had lived in sketch comedy for decades, and shows like The Simpsons had been using flashbacks for jokes since the late 80s. What Family Guy did was turn the cutaway gag into the engine of the entire show rather than an occasional bit of seasoning. A typical Family Guy episode will pause its main story dozens of times to jump to an unrelated joke. Peter says something was the worst thing that ever happened to him, and the show cuts to a 30-second sketch about a different bad thing that happened. Brian uses a phrase, and the show cuts away to act out whatever that phrase reminded the writers of. The plot of any given Family Guy episode is closer to a clothesline that the cutaway gags hang from than it is to a story being told. Once you spot that structure, you cannot unsee it. The second thing was the dysfunctional family setup. Father, mother, 3 kids, weird pet, working-class suburban setting. Father is a buffoon. Mother is patient and capable. The kids are each one note pushed to an extreme. The Simpsons had built that template 17 years earlier, but Family Guy cranked the dial up. Peter Griffin was louder, dumber, more selfish, and more cartoonishly built than Homer Simpson had ever been. The show kept the comforting outline of the family sitcom while filling it with characters who would have been impossible in any earlier version of that genre. That gave the show a structural safety net. No matter how strange a given episode got, the audience always knew where they were. They were in the Griffin living room. The dad was on the couch. The dog was nearby. The third thing was permission. Family Guy granted itself permission to make jokes about subjects other shows on broadcast television would not touch: religion, race, sex, disability, death. The show treated nothing as off-limits, and the cutaway structure gave it cover. A joke that landed badly could simply be left behind, because the next cutaway was 30 seconds away. Whatever discomfort the audience felt with one moment got overwritten by the momentum of the next. This is a real and under-discussed feature of how the show works. The format itself is forgiving in a way that most television formats are not. Cutaway gag, dysfunctional family, permission to go anywhere. That is the whole machine. And once animation domination proved the machine made money, every other network started building copies of it. The first wave came from inside the house. Seth MacFarlane himself spun off The Cleveland Show in 2009, taking a beloved supporting character out of Family Guy and handing him his own series. Other Family Guy writers began developing their own shows under the Fox umbrella. Alan Gregory arrived in 2011 with a Family Guy showrunner attached. Bordertown arrived in 2016 with a Family Guy writer at the helm. Each of these aimed at the same Sunday evening audience Family Guy had built, and each had its own particular relationship to the formula. The second wave came from outside Fox. Comedy Central wanted its own Family Guy. ABC wanted its own Family Guy. Even networks in other countries wanted their own Family Guy. Comedy Central got Brickleberry in 2012 after Fox had passed on the same pilot in 2007 for being too offensive. The Canadian network Teletoon got Crash Canyon in 2011, a show so openly modeled on the cutaway gag formula that even fans of it admitted the resemblance was distracting. Mitchell Hurwitz, the creator of Arrested Development, brought Sit Down, Shut Up to Fox in 2009, hoping to ride the same wave, and watched it get pulled from the schedule after only 4 episodes aired. The third wave was the streaming era. By the late 2010s, broadcast television was no longer the natural home for new adult animation. Netflix had money to spend and no real history of producing animated comedy, so the same creators who had built and lost Brickleberry at Comedy Central walked across the street and pitched Paradise PD, which premiered on Netflix in 2018, used most of the same voice cast, and copied its own predecessor so faithfully that the two shows eventually did a crossover episode about how similar they were. These shows were not all the same. Some were spin-offs. Some were honest copies. Some were trying to do something genuinely different and just got swept into the same critical bucket because they happened to be cartoons aimed at adults during the same 15-year stretch. The job of this piece is to walk through every single one of them and work out which is which shows actually deserve to be called ripoffs, which just got smeared by association, which tried to copy the formula and crashed on takeoff, which tried to copy the formula and got away with it for a while, and what the entire wave, taken together, can teach us about the strange decade and a half when American adult animation tried to mass-produce itself and mostly could not. One number worth holding in your head as a kind of background hum while we go through this. Family Guy is, as of right now, in its 23rd season. It is approaching its 450th episode. It has been cancelled twice and survived both times. It has outlasted every single one of its imitators with one exception, and that exception is American Dad, which was made by the same person. Every other show in this piece is gone. Some lasted a season, some lasted 4. One was scrubbed so completely from the internet after its cancellation that the network removed it from its own website. Most carry a Rotten Tomatoes score in the low double digits and a Metacritic average suggesting the critics did not merely dislike them, but were almost personally offended by them. They aired. They got pulled. The actors moved on. The studios moved on. The audiences forgot. And here we are, years later, ready to drift off to all of them in one long, gentle, comprehensive sweep. There is no malice in this. The shows that failed were, almost all of them, made by people who genuinely believed they had something to offer. Some were ahead of their time. Some were behind their time. Some were exactly on time and just bad. The point of going through them is not to laugh at the corpses. The point is to understand the shape of an industry that, for 15 years, kept trying to bottle the same lightning and kept coming up with empty bottles. The story of Family Guy itself is, in a quiet way, the story of how lightning bottles itself. Cancelled, revived, cancelled, revived, kept on the air past the point where most shows have any business being on the air. Still drawing audiences, still selling DVDs back when DVDs existed, still moving merchandise, still turning up in lunchroom impressions of Stewie. Whatever the show is doing, it is doing something the imitators could not. The shape of that something is what we are going to spend the next several hours circling. By the end, the question will not be why so many of these shows failed. The question will be why Family Guy alone kept working, and what that says about the formula everyone else thought they were copying. Before we move on, if this analysis is landing for you, think about subscribing. It is a real help to the channel. Before any of that though, we need to start with the most successful imitation in the entire wave, and the only one of MacFarlane's own follow-ups still on the air today. The interesting thing about it is that it had every reason to be the most direct copy of all, and instead became the one show that figured out how to be different on purpose. American Dad, 2005, Fox and TBS. The ripoff that refused to be one. Here is something almost nobody outside of television history nerds knows. American Dad premiered on the exact same night Family Guy came back from the dead, February 6, 2005, Super Bowl Sunday. Fox aired the special preview pilot of American Dad as the lead-out program after the game, putting it in the single most watched television slot of the entire year. 3 months later, on May 1, 2005, both Family Guy and American Dad launched their full seasons together as part of the brand new Animation Domination block. Same network, same creator, same animation studio, same Sunday night, same demographic, same pitch in the trade papers, which essentially read, "Seth MacFarlane has another one for you." By every reasonable expectation, American Dad should have been the first and most obvious Family Guy ripoff in history. The setup was suspicious enough on its own. A loud, opinionated father at the head of a suburban family. A patient, capable wife. 2 kids who were each one note pushed to an extreme. A weird, non-human family member living in the house, capable of speaking and getting into trouble. If you held the 2 character sheets next to each other and squinted, the only differences seemed to be that Stan Smith wore a suit instead of a polo shirt, that the family lived in Virginia instead of Rhode Island, and that the talking dog had been swapped out for a talking alien named Roger and a goldfish with a German man's brain inside it named Klaus. The early reviews picked up on this immediately. Critics in 2005 looked at American Dad and called it Family Guy with a flag pin. The internet of the day made the same joke 1,000 different ways. Some viewers refused to watch the show on principle, treating it as a cynical attempt by Fox to double up on the same formula now that the formula was finally working. Even MacFarlane himself, in early interviews, admitted that the show had been pitched and developed during a period when he was still mostly thinking the way he had been thinking when he made Family Guy. The early episodes show that thinking. Cutaway gags appear. Stan and Peter share certain mannerisms. The animation pipeline was the same. The voice acting style was the same, for about half of the first season. American Dad genuinely was a Family Guy ripoff. And then something changed. The story of how American Dad became the only one of MacFarlane's shows to outlast the cutaway gag era is one of the most interesting quiet stories in modern American animation, and it has almost never been told properly. The change did not come from MacFarlane himself. He co-created American Dad with two writers named Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman, both of whom had come up through Family Guy and had been waiting for a chance to run their own show. By the second season, MacFarlane had started pulling back from the day-to-day work of American Dad to focus on Family Guy and the eventual launch of the Cleveland show. Barker and Weitzman were left alone in the writer's room, and what they decided to do with that freedom was, season by season, walk the show in a completely different direction from anything Family Guy was doing. The first big decision was to abandon the cutaway gag. This is genuinely radical when you think about it. The cutaway gag was the engine of the entire animation domination wave. Every executive at every network believed the cutaway was the secret of the formula. The cutaway was what made Family Guy feel different from The Simpsons. The cutaway was what made the show fast and dense and quotable. Walking away from the cutaway was, in 2006, like a band that had just had a hit single, deciding to release an entirely instrumental album as its follow-up. The Barker and Weitzman writers' room did it anyway. By around the third season, the cutaway gags in American Dad had become rare, and by the fifth season, they had essentially disappeared from the show entirely. What replaced the cutaway was character. American Dad started running long jokes that paid off across an entire episode, rather than 30-second jokes that paid off and disappeared. The show began building actual continuity. Things that happened in one episode would still be true in the next. Characters changed. Roger the Alien started developing a roster of personas that the writers tracked as a kind of running bit, each persona with its own clothing, voice, vocabulary, and history. By the time the show was a few seasons in, Roger had over 100 named alter egos, and the show treated them as if they were real characters living inside one body. This is the kind of decision that breaks most cartoon shows. Continuity is dangerous. It means every new viewer has to catch up on 100 small references before a given joke makes sense. It means the writer's room has to remember everything they did before. It means the show stops being something a casual viewer can drop into halfway through and immediately understand. American Dad made all of those bets, and against every prediction in the industry, the show kept getting funnier as it leaned into them. The other big decision was to let the show get strange. Where Family Guy used its cutaway structure to do 100 little jokes per episode, American Dad started doing one big premise per episode and committing to it completely. An episode might begin with Stan trying to get a parking spot at the mall and end 22 minutes later with Stan having faked his own death, started a new family in another country, and accidentally caused a small war. The show treated its premises as roller coasters that you got on at the start and rode all the way to wherever the writers had decided to crash them. Several episodes from the show's middle seasons are now considered among the best individual episodes any adult animated show has ever produced. Tearjerker, a full James Bond parody. The Vacation Goo, which revealed that an entire season of family vacation memories had been computer-generated implants. Rapture's Delight, an episode about the Christian apocalypse that committed so completely to its premise that the whole family ended up living in a post-apocalyptic wasteland for most of the runtime. None of these episodes could have been made on Family Guy. Family Guy is structurally incapable of committing to a premise for that long, because the cutaway gag is always pulling the show off the road. American Dad, by walking away from that engine, found space for a kind of long-form animated comedy nobody else on Sunday night was doing. The audience noticed, not loudly and not all at once, but steadily. American Dad never had the cultural footprint of Family Guy. There was no merchandise tidal wave. Stan Smith never appeared on a million dorm room posters. Roger never became a meme on the level of Stewie. But the show kept its audience season after season and kept its quality high while Family Guy started drawing criticism for declining writing and kept getting renewed anyway. Then, in 2014, something happened that would have killed almost any other show. Fox decided to pull American Dad out of the animation domination block. The block was being restructured. The network wanted live-action comedies in the Sunday slot, and American Dad, despite its consistent quality, was the show chosen to be moved off broadcast television. The series was sent to TBS, the basic cable channel, where it began its 11th season in the fall of 2014. For most adult cartoons, getting moved from network to basic cable is the long, slow goodbye. The audience scatters, the budget shrinks, the press coverage stops, new episodes air with no fanfare, and the show quietly ends a few seasons later, mostly forgotten. American Dad did the opposite. The show went to TBS and got better. The basic cable rules were looser than the broadcast rules, which meant the writers could swear more, push violence further, and take stranger swings than they had been allowed to take on Fox. The show kept its existing fan base, picked up new viewers who only watched cable, and ran on TBS for 10 straight years. Through 2024, American Dad kept producing new episodes, while almost every other show in this piece had been canceled, forgotten, scrubbed from the internet, or all three. In March 2025, Fox announced that American Dad was coming back home. The show would return to broadcast television in 2026 to begin its 22nd season, airing on Animation Domination alongside The Simpsons, Family Guy, and Bob's Burgers. The show is also already locked in through season 25, which would put it at over 400 episodes by the time it concludes. To put that plainly, American Dad has now been on the air for over 2 decades, has produced more episodes than most live-action sitcoms in television history, and is currently outlasting almost every show that ever tried to copy its older sibling. This is the part that matters for the larger story. Every show in this piece is, in some way, a response to Family Guy. American Dad's response was the strangest of all, because the response was, "Do not be Family Guy. Do not use the cutaway gag. Do not depend on shock for its own sake. Do not treat the family as a clothesline for unrelated jokes. Build characters who can carry a story. Build stories that can carry a season. Build a show an audience can actually live inside rather than briefly visit." That is the lesson none of the shows that came later seemed willing to learn. Most of the imitators that arrived after American Dad doubled down on the cutaway gag, the shock humor, and the loose plot structure, on the theory that those were the elements that made Family Guy work. American Dad had quietly proven, in real time, that the elements which made Family Guy work were also the elements that put a ceiling on how long Family Guy could keep working at full strength. By stepping away from those elements, American Dad found a kind of staying power nothing else in the wave was able to find. There is a cost to this approach worth being honest about. American Dad is not as quotable as Family Guy. There is no American Dad equivalent of the Bird is the Word episode, or the Surfing Bird musical number that lives in millions of phone memes. The show's strength is that you have to watch it in order, with the previous episodes in your head, to get the full effect. That is why it never became a phenomenon the way Family Guy did. Phenomena need surface energy. American Dad has depth instead. The trade is real, and the show made it on purpose. Critics over the years have noticed this. Reviews of American Dad's later seasons consistently note that the show has become more experimental, more willing to take big swings on individual episodes, and more emotionally invested in its own characters than its supposed older sibling. Stan Smith, by the later seasons, is no longer the loud one-note conservative father he started as in 2005. He has been given an inner life. His relationship with Roger has been treated episode by episode as one of the strangest and most genuine friendships in animated television history. Steve, the son, has been allowed to fail and grow in ways Chris Griffin on Family Guy has never been allowed to fail or grow. Haley, the daughter, has aged on screen, married, had a kid, and changed her politics over the course of the show's run. None of that sounds like the description of a show that started life as a Family Guy ripoff. That is exactly the point. What American Dad teaches the rest of this piece is something most viewers will not have considered. The shows that came later, the ones canceled after 1 season or 3, the ones that had to be scrubbed from streaming services, the ones nobody remembers anymore, all believed that copying Family Guy meant copying its surface. They copied the cutaway gag. They copied the dysfunctional family setup. They copied the willingness to push past good taste, and almost none of them survived. American Dad copied the surface for about half a season and then walked away from it, and 21 years later, it is still on the air. The implication of that is heavier than it sounds at first. If American Dad survived by not being Family Guy, then maybe what made Family Guy survive was not the cutaway gag, the dysfunctional family, or the permission to go anywhere. Maybe those were the symptoms, not the cause. Maybe the actual cause was something nobody managed to copy, because nobody could see it clearly enough to know what it was. That is a question this piece is going to keep coming back to in different ways with every show that follows. Each failed imitator will be, in its own way, evidence about what the real secret was. For now, the headline is simple. The first show to come out of MacFarlane's office after Family Guy returned was the one show in the entire wave that figured out how to last. It did so by being the most disobedient ripoff in the history of the format. Everything that followed could have learned from that. Almost nothing did. Before we move on, if this analysis is landing for you, think about subscribing. It is a real help to the channel. Which brings us to the show that did exactly the opposite of American Dad. The show that took a single beloved Family Guy character, walked him out of Quahog, dropped him into a new town, and tried to recreate the cutaway gag formula, one for one, with a different family wrapped around it. That show was the one that taught Fox a hard lesson about whether you can clone the same machine twice and expect both copies to keep running. The Cleveland Show, 2009 to 2013, Fox. The spin-off that got compared to Family Guy in blackface. The pitch should have worked. Cleveland Brown had been part of Family Guy from the beginning. He was one of Peter Griffin's 3 best friends, alongside Joe Swanson and Glenn Quagmire, and he sat next to Peter at the Drunken Clam every week, the way friends sit next to each other in real bars in real towns. He had a gentle voice. He had a slow, friendly way of talking that made him sound like the calmest man in any room, which was funny because the room he was usually in contained Peter Griffin. He had a long-running gag where his bathtub would burst through the side of his house and slide him down the street, naked and startled, while a tinkling piano played in the background. By the late 2000s, Cleveland was one of the most well-liked characters on the entire show. The fan base had warmed to him in a way it had not warmed to most of the side cast. So in 2007, Seth MacFarlane started thinking about giving Cleveland his own show. The reasoning made sense at the level of a business meeting. Family Guy was now a hit. American Dad was working. Animation Domination was the most reliable Sunday night programming block on broadcast television. A third MacFarlane show in the same lineup would mean 3 hours of Sunday programming under his name, 3 streams of merchandise revenue, 3 syndication libraries piling up over time. King of the Hill, the long-running Mike Judge show that had been holding down the 8:30 slot since 1997, was nearing its end. Fox needed something to fill that hole. A Family Guy spin-off was the obvious answer, and Cleveland was the obvious character to spin off. The show appeared on Fox's development slate in early 2008. By June 2009, the network had announced that The Cleveland Show would premiere that fall. The pilot leaked online ahead of time, a leak that some sources at the time suggested was deliberate, since the reaction to it was strong enough that Fox renewed the show for a second season before the first episode had even aired on television. That is an unusual move. Renewing a show before the audience has seen a single broadcast is the kind of confidence networks usually only have when they think they cannot lose. The Cleveland show premiered September 27, 2009. The setup moved Cleveland out of Quahog, Rhode Island, and back to his hometown of Stool Bend, Virginia. He left Family Guy at the end of the previous season, told Quagmire he was getting a spin-off, and walked off into his own theme song. In Stool Bend, Cleveland reunited with Donna, an old high school flame, and married her. Donna came with 2 kids of her own, a teenage daughter named Roberta and a 5-year-old son named Rallo. Cleveland brought along his own son, Cleveland Jr., who in Family Guy had been a small, energetic, average-sized child. For the spin-off, Cleveland Jr. was redesigned as an obese, soft-spoken, gentle teenager. He looked nothing like he had on the parent show. The original voice actor, Mike Henry, kept voicing Cleveland and Rallo, but Cleveland Jr. was handed off to Kevin Michael Richardson, who gave the character a completely different voice and energy. The supporting cast included a talking bear named Tim, voiced for the first season by Seth MacFarlane himself, who lived next door and acted as Cleveland's new friend the way Quagmire had been Cleveland's friend in Family Guy. There were 2 redneck brothers named Lester and Holt, who served as the new local barflies. There was a sad-faced bartender named Gus, played by David Lynch, the legendary film director, in one of the strangest casting choices in the entire run of animation domination. Lynch stayed with the show for years, voicing every appearance of Gus, and almost nobody who watched the show casually realized that one of the most acclaimed living American filmmakers was doing voice work on a Sunday night cartoon. Reviews were mixed from day one. Rotten Tomatoes recorded a 44% approval rating for the first season. Some critics were generous. Rob Owen of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette wrote that the show was as rude and crude as Family Guy, but had more warmth because Cleveland was a more likable lead than Peter Griffin. Owen praised the talking bear, calling Tim by far the most amusing creation on the show. Other critics were not generous at all. Tom Shales, writing for the Washington Post, delivered one of the harshest reviews of MacFarlane's career as a producer, comparing him to a dirty old man hanging around playgrounds with naughty pictures or risque jokes as lures. Roberto Bianco at USA Today wrote that the easiest fix for the show's problems was cancellation. The harshest line came from John McWhorter, the linguist and cultural commentator, writing in the New Republic. McWhorter called the Cleveland show a patronizing mess and described it as basically Family Guy in blackface. That phrase stuck. For a certain segment of the show's critics, it became the entire problem with the spin-off in 7 words. The criticism McWhorter and others were pointing at was specific. Cleveland on Family Guy had been a quiet, calm, gentle man whose comedy came from the contrast between his peaceful voice and the chaos around him. The Cleveland show kept his voice, but surrounded him with a cast of broad, loud, often stereotyped black characters whose comedy came from being broad, loud, and stereotyped. Rallo, the 5-year-old, was written as a tiny, aggressive ladies' man whose voice Mike Henry had originally created decades earlier for prank phone calls. Roberta, the teenage daughter, was sexualized in ways the show treated as a running joke. Lester and Holt, the rednecks, were exactly the kinds of cartoon Southerners critics had been complaining about in animation for 50 years. The supporting cast leaned heavily on the same kinds of broad humor Family Guy had used, but applied to a black community in a black neighborhood, written by a writer's room that was overwhelmingly white. The show was aware of this criticism. It was aware in the way Family Guy is always aware of criticism, which is to say, it sometimes addressed the issue head-on with a joke and sometimes ignored it completely. There were episodes that engaged with race in genuinely thoughtful ways. There were episodes that did the exact thing critics were complaining about, with no apparent self-consciousness. The show was trying, in some sense, to be both Family Guy and a sitcom about Black American suburban life, and the gears of those two ambitions did not always fit together. The ratings tell the rest of the story plainly. The first season averaged decent numbers thanks to curiosity and the lead-in from Family Guy. By the second season, the audience was already thinning. By the third season, the show was clearly on a slow downward slope. By the fourth season, the writing was on the wall. Industry observers at the time noted that the final 2 seasons of the Cleveland show may have been ordered specifically to push the episode count past the syndication threshold. In American television, a show generally needs around 88 episodes to be sold profitably as reruns to other networks. The Cleveland show ended its run on May 19, 2013, with exactly 88 episodes produced. That number is not a coincidence. That number is the entire reason the show kept getting renewed when its ratings did not justify renewal. Fox kept the spin-off alive long enough to hit the magic syndication number and then ended it. Kevin Riley, the Fox chairman of entertainment, confirmed the cancellation in May 2013. The Cleveland show became the first MacFarlane-penned show to be canceled with no expectation of revival. Family Guy had been canceled twice and come back. The Cleveland show was canceled once and stayed gone. What happened next is one of the strangest moves in modern animation history. After the cancellation, MacFarlane announced that Cleveland and his Stoolbend family would be returning to Family Guy, not as guests, but as permanent residents. In Family Guy Season 12, in the episode He's Blah-Ack, the entire Brown family moved back to Quahog. Cleveland, Donna, Cleveland Jr., Roberta, and Rallo all relocated into the house next door to the Griffins. The spin-off had simply been folded back into the parent show, the way a failed branch on a family tree gets pruned and the trunk keeps growing. Family Guy itself made jokes about the cancellation. There is an episode of Family Guy called Inside Family Guy, where Cleveland is shown wallowing in shame over his show's cancellation. There is a moment in The Simpsons Guy, the famous Family Guy and Simpsons crossover, where Peter is shown casually carrying Cleveland in his airplane after Cleveland's own plane crash landed into the ground, a visual joke about the spin-off's cancellation and its dependence on the parent series. The show, in other words, ate its own failure as material. The cancellation became a running gag. Cleveland came home, slotted back into the bar at the Drunken Clam, and the Family Guy machine continued. There is a postscript that has to be mentioned because it changes the meaning of the entire spin-off in retrospect. In June 2020, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests following the killing of George Floyd, Mike Henry, the white voice actor who had played Cleveland from the very first Family Guy episode in 1999, announced that he was stepping down from the role. Henry stated publicly that a black character should be voiced by a black actor, and that he was leaving the role to make room for that to happen. He had voiced Cleveland for over 20 years across both Family Guy and The Cleveland Show. The role has not been formally recast on Family Guy as of 2026, though actor Wendell Pierce has stated publicly that he would be interested in taking over the part. What this means for The Cleveland Show as a project is uncomfortable. The entire run of the spin-off, which was already being criticized in real time for being a show about a black community written by a mostly white writer's room and led by a white voice actor, became, after 2020, a much harder show to defend. Henry's own decision to step down can be read as a quiet acknowledgement that the criticism had been valid all along. The show's full run is still available on Hulu and Disney Plus internationally, but it is rarely discussed in lists of great adult cartoons, and most retrospectives of MacFarlane's career mention it as a footnote rather than a centerpiece. Looking back at the show now, with everything we know, the most accurate description of what The Cleveland Show actually was is something simpler than the harsh contemporary reviews suggested. The Cleveland Show was a Family Guy episode stretched out for 4 full seasons. The structure was the same. The cutaway gags were the same. The pacing of the jokes was the same. The willingness to push past good taste was the same. The show even reused background characters from the parent series and shared writers and animators with both Family Guy and American Dad. The thing it was trying to do was take the Family Guy machine, paint it a slightly different color, point it at a different community, and run it on the same Sunday night. The machine ran. It just did not run as well. The lesson the network seemed to take from this is the wrong one. Fox concluded, based on the Cleveland Show's modest performance, that the issue was the audience's interest in Cleveland specifically as a lead character. They concluded that the formula had not been the problem, and that a different lead with a different setup might still produce another long-running hit. That conclusion would lead directly to the next several attempts at MacFarlane-adjacent shows on the network, each of which would copy the formula in slightly different ways, and each of which would fail in slightly different ways. The lesson the audience took from it was different and quieter. The audience seemed to absorb, without ever stating it directly, that the Cleveland Show had revealed something about Family Guy the parent show had been hiding. Family Guy worked because of Family Guy. The Cleveland Show, by trying to bottle the same lightning with the same formula and the same studio and the same network and the same time slot, had proven that the lightning was not in the formula. The lightning was somewhere else, somewhere harder to find. The Cleveland Show is the most honest failure in the entire wave because it had every advantage. It had the parent show feeding it audience. It had MacFarlane himself in the producer's chair. It had the same animation studio and the same broadcast slot. It had been pre-renewed before its first episode aired. It had a likable lead character with 12 seasons of audience goodwill behind him. It still could not become Family Guy. Nothing about Cleveland's relocation to Stool Bend ever felt as alive as Cleveland's bathtub gag had felt in Quahog. The spin-off existed for 4 years and then disappeared back into the parent show, taking its 88 episodes into the syndication market and leaving almost nothing behind in cultural memory. By 2010, Fox was no longer the only network trying to manufacture a Family Guy of its own. The success of animation domination had pushed every other broadcast network in America to start hunting for their own version. ABC, the Disney-owned network that had not aired a successful adult animated series in years, decided that 2009 was the year to try. They greenlit a show with one of the most respected names in animation history attached to it, paired him with 2 writers from one of the most acclaimed cartoons of the 1990s, and put the entire project on the air with full network confidence behind it. Before we move on, if this analysis is landing for you, think about subscribing. It is a real help to the channel. That show was about a family of liberals, not a family of working-class buffoons, and it was created by a man who had built his career on doing the opposite of what Family Guy did. The way it failed is its own kind of evidence about how badly the rest of the industry was misreading the Family Guy formula. Sit Down, Shut Up, 2009, Fox. The animation domination casualty that lasted 4 episodes. The strange thing about Sit Down, Shut Up is that, on paper, it should not have been a Family Guy ripoff at all. The man behind it was Mitchell Hurwitz. If that name does not ring an immediate bell, his other show might. Hurwitz created Arrested Development, the live-action sitcom that ran on Fox from 2003 to 2006, was canceled by the network, became a cult phenomenon during its dead years on DVD, and was eventually revived by Netflix in 2013. Arrested Development is, by almost any reasonable measure, one of the best-written comedies in American television history. It is a show built on dense plotting, layered jokes that pay off 3 seasons later, a specific kind of dry, theatrical voice acting, and characters whose stupidity has a strange dignity to it. It is not, in any sense, a cutaway gag cartoon. So, when Hurwitz announced in 2008 that he was developing an animated comedy for Fox, the assumption among critics was that he was going to bring something genuinely new to the Sunday night block. The early press coverage was warm. The casting was extraordinary. Will Arnett, who had played Gob Bluth on Arrested Development, was on board. So was Jason Bateman, the lead of that show. So was Will Forte from Saturday Night Live, Tom Kenny from SpongeBob SquarePants, Nick Kroll, Kristen Chenoweth, Cherry O'Terry, Kenan Thompson, and Henry Winkler, who had played the family lawyer Barry Zuckerkorn on Arrested Development. That cast, on paper, was strong enough to carry almost anything. The premise was modest. A group of teachers and administrators at a fictional Florida high school struggling to do their jobs while mostly not caring about education. The show was based on an Australian live-action sitcom of the same name, created by Brendan Reed and Tim Minchin, which Hurwitz had seen and admired. He had originally wanted to adapt it as a live-action American show, but every American network he pitched it to had told him the characters were too broad, too self-centered, too oblivious to work in live action. So he pulled the script back, sat on it for years, and eventually decided the only way to make those characters work was to animate them. That decision is the entire reason. Sit Down, Shut Up ended up being treated as a Family Guy adjacent show, even though almost nothing in its DNA actually traced back to Family Guy. By 2009, animation on Fox meant animation domination. Animation domination meant Family Guy. The block was the brand. Anything that aired on it was being measured against the same yardstick. Hurwitz's show, on Sunday night at 8:30, was, in the eyes of critics and casual viewers, a show that had to compete with the Griffins or fall behind. The show premiered April 19, 2009. It got the prized 8:30 slot, sandwiched between The Simpsons and Family Guy itself. The premiere drew a respectable 5.2 million viewers. By the second episode, the audience had dropped to 4.2 million. Fox responded by moving the show out of the 8:30 slot and pushing it back to 7, the slot networks use when they have stopped believing in something and want to bury it gently. By the fourth episode, the show was being reviewed badly enough that Fox quietly stopped airing new episodes altogether. Only 4 episodes ever made it to the animation domination block. The remaining 9 episodes, already animated and finished, sat on a shelf for months. Eventually, Fox dumped them on Saturday nights at midnight, starting in September 2009, where almost nobody saw them. Comedy Central picked up the reruns the following May, aired them for a few weeks, then quietly stopped doing that as well. The series was officially canceled on November 21, 2009. Total runtime on its original network, about 4 months. Total episodes ever produced, 13. Total episodes that aired in the slot they were made for, 4. The reviews were brutal in a specific way that is worth examining closely, because they tell you what was actually wrong with the show. The Orlando Sentinel called the series a disaster. Newsday described the show as raw, vulgar, and blatantly offensive, with so many double and triple meanings stacked into so many sexual jokes that the show seemed to forget it had any other ambitions. The Hollywood Reporter wrote that the show used fourth wall breaks badly, and that it was painful to watch how hard it was trying to be funny. Glenn Garvin in the Miami Herald wrote that Hurwitz was the first of many talents wasted to the point of criminality in the adaptation. Variety made the most pointed observation, writing that despite the pedigree of the cast and the creator, the show seldom rose above sniggering double meanings, and that it appeared preoccupied with impressing teenage boys to the exclusion of any other audience. That last review is the one that explains the failure best. Variety had identified the trap. Hurwitz had brought a live-action sensibility, a strong cast, and a high-minded creator's pedigree to a network slot that was already locked into a specific kind of humor. Animation domination by 2009 had trained its audience to expect a particular rhythm. Cutaway gags, shock punchlines, a specific kind of cheerful, crude joke about sex or bodily functions arriving every 30 seconds. Family Guy had built that rhythm. The audience that turned up on Sundays was the audience that wanted that rhythm. Sit Down, Shut Up tried to imitate that rhythm in places, especially in the early episodes, and the result was that the show ended up sounding like a worse version of Family Guy in the parts where it was trying to be Family Guy, and like a confused version of Arrested Development in the parts where it was trying to be Arrested Development. There was one technical decision that made this worse, and it deserves its own paragraph. Hurwitz had decided that Sit Down, Shut Up would use a specific visual style, blending hand-drawn animated characters against real-life photographic backgrounds. The school featured in the show was actually a real school next door to the animation studio. The photos were taken on location, and then characters were drawn on top of them. The style was inspired by a children's book called Knuffle Bunny, written by Mo Willems, who was personally contacted to design the show's characters. The animation studio he chose, Rough Draft Studios in South Korea, was the same studio that had produced Futurama for Matt Groening. That visual choice was unique. Nothing else on television looked like it. In a fairer world, it might have given the show its own identity, the way the squiggle animation of home movies had given that show a distinct flavor on Adult Swim earlier in the decade. But the visual choice did not match the comedic content. The crude, shock-based humor the writers were leaning on did not benefit from being placed in front of real photographs of a real school. It ended up looking like a strange experimental art project that had been forced to host fart jokes. Reviews repeatedly mentioned that the animation was interesting in theory, but distracting in practice, and that the photographic backgrounds called more attention to themselves than the show could afford. The voice cast, which should have been the show's saving grace, ended up being its most painful loss. Will Arnett, who plays a meathead gym teacher named Ennis Hoftard, gives a genuinely strong performance. Reviews from the Times singled him out as the one element of the show that worked, with several critics writing that Arnett essentially stole the show. Henry Winkler, voicing the assistant principal Stuart Prosekian, also drew good notices. The problem was that Arnett and Winkler being good in a bad show was not the same thing as a good show. The cast were carrying material that did not deserve them. Hurwitz himself, in interviews after the cancellation, was relatively gracious about what had happened. He had been honest with the press during development that he was taking a more supervisory role on the show rather than running it day to day, which is a thing creators say when they want some distance from a project. He took on the writing of the first script and then stepped back. After the cancellation, he went on to other things. The Arrested Development revival came 4 years later. He has not made another animated show since. There is a reading of Sit Down, Shut Up that treats its failure as evidence that animation domination itself had become a closed system by 2009. Anything that aired on the block had to either commit fully to the cutaway gag, shock comedy formula Family Guy had built, or distinguish itself so completely that the audience could not mistake it for an attempt at the formula. Sit Down, Shut Up did neither. It tried to do both at once. It had moments of genuine cleverness, particularly in the wordplay, inherited from Hurwitz's Arrested Development sensibility. It had moments of crude shock humor copied straight from the Family Guy playbook. The two never blended. Audiences who tuned in expecting Family Guy found something stranger and quieter. Audiences who tuned in expecting Arrested Development found something cruder and dumber. Neither audience stayed. This is a pattern that will repeat across this piece in different forms with different shows. The animation domination slot was not a neutral piece of real estate. It came with expectations. Any show that landed there was being measured against Family Guy, whether it wanted to be or not, and that measurement was the thing that killed Sit Down, Shut Up faster than its actual quality probably deserved. A show with this cast and this pedigree, airing in a less specific block, might have been given more time to find its footing. The show had been moved out of its original slot after only 2 episodes had aired. By any standard, that is not enough time for a comedy to develop a voice. Most shows take a full season or 2 before they figure out what they are. Sit Down, Shut Up never got that chance. Fox pulled it before it had a chance to become anything. The show that ended up in the Comedy Central late-night rotation a year later was not the show Hurwitz had intended to make. It was 13 episodes of a show that had been killed in its infancy and then briefly resurrected for the kind of viewers who happened to be awake at 1 in the morning and willing to watch anything. The lesson hidden inside this failure is uncomfortable for the larger story this piece is telling. Sit Down, Shut Up is the only show in the entire wave whose creator had a genuinely strong pedigree from outside the Family Guy ecosystem. Hurwitz was not a McFarlane writer. He had not come up through animation domination. He had built his reputation in live-action comedy with one of the most acclaimed sitcoms of the decade, working with a completely different set of comedic instincts. He had every reason to make something different. And what he ended up making was something critics described as desperate, vulgar, and trying too hard to fit into the slot it had been given. If a creator with Hurwitz's resume could not avoid being absorbed into the Family Guy template when handed a Sunday night animated comedy on Fox, that suggests the template itself had a kind of gravity. It pulled creators toward it, whether they intended to be pulled or not. The slot rewarded certain choices and punished others. The audience that showed up wanted what they had been trained to want. The economics of the block rewarded cutaway gags because cutaway gags were cheap, fast, and easy to write. Anything that resisted those forces had to resist them with extraordinary clarity, which Sit Down, Shut Up did not have. There is a final, almost sad detail about the show that has to be mentioned. The remaining 9 episodes that aired on Saturday nights at midnight were technically considered the official broadcast of the full first season. Some of those later episodes, according to the few people who saw them, were genuinely better than the ones that had aired in prime time. The show was finding its voice in the back half. By the time it found that voice, almost nobody was watching anymore. The audience had been given a first impression, decided they did not like it, and never came back. Television is unforgiving in that specific way. A show gets one chance to introduce itself. If it fumbles the introduction, the show is gone. Sit Down, Shut Up was gone by November 2009. Hurwitz went back to live action. The cast scattered. Mo Willems went back to writing children's books. The photographic background visual style was never used by another show. The whole project disappeared into the kind of cultural footnote only animation historians remember. Before we move on, if this analysis is landing for you, think about subscribing. It is a real help to the channel. But Fox was not done hunting. The network had built animation domination on the back of one impossible comeback story, and the executives in charge were still convinced that another hit was hiding somewhere in their development slate. 2 years after Sit Down, Shut Up was buried, Fox handed the Sunday night animated comedy slot to a young movie star with no animation experience whatsoever, paired him with a Family Guy showrunner, and bet that celebrity heat alone could deliver the next breakout. What aired instead was the worst received animated show in the network's modern history. The kind of failure that does not just get cancelled, the kind of failure that gets erased. Alan Gregory, 2011, Fox. The Jonah Hill disaster. Fox tried to erase. There is a specific category of television failure that goes beyond bad reviews and low ratings. It is the kind of failure where the network that made the show actively wants the show to stop existing, where the program is removed from the network's official website, where digital downloads are pulled, where the show is never released on DVD or Blu-ray, where streaming services that should logically carry it simply do not, where, years later, The only legal way to buy the show anywhere in the world is through a single distributor in the United Kingdom, because every other market has agreed that the smartest commercial decision is to behave as if the show was never made. That category exists. There is one show in the entire history of animation domination that fits inside it. That show is Alan Gregory. The development of Alan Gregory has to start with the man who pitched it. Jonah Hill in 2010 was, in career terms, well established and only 26 on a calendar, and he had just become one of the hottest young actors in Hollywood. Superbad had come out in 2007, Knocked Up that same year, Forgetting Sarah Marshall in 2008, Get Him to the Greek in 2010. By the time Alan Gregory was being developed, Hill was about to receive his first Academy Award nomination for Moneyball. He was, in industry terms, a name that opened doors. Networks wanted to be in business with him. Studios wanted his next project. And Hill, like many young actors who suddenly find themselves with that kind of leverage, decided to use it to make something he had wanted to make for years. What he wanted to make was an animated television series. Hill had no background in animation. He had not written for cartoons. He had not voiced a major animated role. He had not been involved in the production side of any animated project. He simply wanted to do one. He partnered with two writers named Andrew Mogul and Jared Paul, both of whom had live-action comedy backgrounds, and the three of them developed a pilot script together. The premise was unusual. Alan Gregory was a pretentious, condescending, hyper-articulate 7-year-old boy who lived in a luxury loft with two adoptive fathers and an adopted Cambodian sister. The economic recession had forced his family to send him to public elementary school for the first time, and the comedy was supposed to come from this miniature adult navigating the world of normal children and being confused, appalled, and infuriated by them. Fox bought it. The network ordered 7 episodes in October 2010. By July 2011, 6 additional scripts were ordered, suggesting Fox had been planning a full 13-episode first season. The casting filled in around Hill, who would voice the title character. French Stewart, the actor best known from Third Rock from the Sun, was cast as Richard, Alan's father. Nat Faxon, the actor and writer who would later co-write The Descendants, was cast as Jeremy, Richard's husband. Will Forte, Joy Osmansky, and Christina Puccelli rounded out the supporting cast. The most important hire on the show was a man named David A. Goodman. Goodman is the showrunner detail that locks Alan Gregory into the Family Guy ecosystem in a way almost no other show in this piece is locked in. He had spent 6 years writing for Family Guy, from the show's 2005 revival through the end of its 9th season, working his way up to executive producer on the parent series. When he agreed to leave Family Guy to run Alan Gregory, he was bringing with him every piece of institutional knowledge about how the animation domination machine worked. Alan Gregory was, in the language of the industry, the closest thing to an officially blessed Family Guy adjacent show Fox had attempted up to that point. The DNA was direct. The slot was the same. The audience expectations were the same. The only thing that was different was the leading character, who happened to be a precocious 7-year-old with a vocabulary larger than his entire elementary school combined. The animation studio attached to the show was Bento Box Entertainment, the same studio that had recently launched Bob's Burgers earlier that year. That detail will become important later in this piece, because Bento Box is the thread that ties Alan Gregory to several other shows on this list, including one that arrived 5 years later and failed in almost the same way. Alan Gregory premiered on Fox on October 30th, 2011. It aired Sundays at 8:30, the King of the Hill slot, the slot the Cleveland show had taken over and was now sharing. The reaction was immediate and almost unanimously negative. Chris Swanson at What Culture gave the pilot half a star out of 5 and wrote that there was nothing charming, witty, or interesting about the show. Most major American critics either ignored the show entirely or reviewed it briefly and dismissively. The Rotten Tomatoes critic score settled at 12%. The audience score landed at 19%. The Metacritic average came in at 40 out of 100. The IMDb user rating dropped quickly to 4.3 out of 10 and stayed there. Those numbers, taken together, place Alan Gregory in the bottom percentile of every adult animated show ever produced by a major American network. The reasons for the failure showed up in review after review, and they all pointed in the same direction. The lead character was unlikable in a way that was not entertaining. Alan Gregory himself, as written, was selfish, arrogant, condescending, and obsessed with humiliating people he considered beneath him. The show kept trying to set him up as a precocious child the audience could find charming despite his flaws, the way Stewie Griffin had been set up on Family Guy a decade earlier. But Stewie's villain comedy worked because Stewie was so cartoonishly small, so explicitly evil, and so obviously unable to follow through on any of his plans that the audience could enjoy his menace. Alan Gregory was a semi-realistically drawn 7-year-old who behaved like a real-world version of the worst person you knew in college. The cruelty had no escape valve. Alan's father, Richard, was even worse. The show established that Richard had become attracted to Jeremy years earlier, when Jeremy was a happily married social worker, and had pursued him relentlessly until Jeremy abandoned his life and agreed to marry Richard. The framing of this backstory was played for laughs. The implication that Richard had essentially destroyed an innocent man's family through harassment and obsession was treated as a charming origin story for a comedy couple. Viewers, including ones generally tolerant of dark humor, flagged this immediately as something the show had not earned the right to joke about. A romance subplot was the breaking point for many viewers. Alan Gregory developed an infatuation with his school principal, an elderly woman named Judith Gottlieb. The show treated this as one of its central running gags, with Alan persistently and inappropriately fixating on the principal and repeatedly crossing clear boundaries, while she was forced to tolerate his behavior because of pressure from a school superintendent who happened to be friends with Alan's father. This material, played out across multiple episodes, was the thing that pushed even sympathetic reviewers into open hostility. There was no version of these jokes that worked. The premise was too uncomfortable to laugh at and too lazy to be making any kind of larger point. The animation, produced by Bento Box, drew its own complaints. Reviewers described the visual style as stilted, with character designs that seemed to be reaching for the warm, hand-drawn look of King of the Hill, but landing in a strange visual middle ground. Alan himself, as designed, looked more like a ventriloquist's dummy than a child. His sister Julie was given an enormous forehead that became a recurring source of mockery online. The studio was capable of better work. Bob's Burgers, animated at the same studio in the same period, looks completely different and drew completely different reactions. The problem with Alan Gregory's animation was not the studio's technical ability. It was the design choices, which had been signed off on at the production level and which nobody at Fox had pushed back on. Even the show's own animators reportedly disliked the project from day one, although they spoke positively about the experience of working together. That detail comes from later interviews and write-ups about the show, where staff who had been involved in the production were willing to discuss what had happened on the condition that they did not have to defend the final result. Fox's confidence in the show collapsed quickly. The original order had been for 13 episodes. Only 7 were ever produced. The remaining 6 scripts that had been commissioned in July were never animated. The show was officially canceled on January 8, 2012, when Fox Entertainment president Kevin Riley announced at the Television Critics Association Winter Press Tour that the network would not be making any more episodes. Riley's words at the time were brief and final. The decision had been made. What happened after the cancellation is the part that pushes Alan Gregory into the special category mentioned at the start of this section. Fox did not just stop making the show. Fox actively removed it. References to the series were stripped from the network's official website. Digital downloads were pulled from major distributors. The show was not released on DVD. It was not released on Blu-ray. When Hulu, the streaming service partly owned by Fox at the time, eventually became the home for the network's other animated series, Alan Gregory was excluded. The show effectively ceased to exist on any legitimate platform in the United States. International rights were sold off in places, but in most markets, the show simply disappeared. As of 2026, the United Kingdom remains the only major market in the world where Alan Gregory is still commercially available for purchase. The show survives, of course, the way all old television survives in the streaming era, through unofficial uploads on video sharing sites that get taken down and re-uploaded constantly. But there is no official, sanctioned, network-supported version of Alan Gregory anywhere on the internet. The network that made it has spent over a decade behaving as if it never made it. Family Guy itself made one acknowledgement of the show after the cancellation. In Season 12 of Family Guy, in the episode Boopity Bappity, Alan Gregory makes a brief cameo. He shows up, he has a line, he leaves. That is the sum total of his presence in the larger McFarlane-adjacent animated universe. A character who had been the lead of his own series got a single cameo on the parent network's flagship show 2 years after his own show had been cancelled, and then was never seen again. The lesson Fox seemed to take from Alan Gregory was a strange one. The network did not appear to conclude that the formula was the problem, that animation domination had become too narrow, or that pairing a young actor with no animation background with a veteran Family Guy showrunner had been a flawed model from the start. The network appeared to conclude that Alan Gregory specifically had been an unfortunate one-off, a project that simply had too many bad ideas baked into it to recover. Fox kept developing new animated comedies. Several of them would launch in the years after Alan Gregory was buried, and several of them would fail in different ways. None would fail quite as completely as this one. The lesson Jonah Hill took from the experience is harder to read, because Hill rarely talks about Alan Gregory in interviews. He moved on. His film career continued upward through the 2010s. His next animated project, if he ever attempts another one, has not yet been announced. The two co-creators, Mogul and Paul, continued working in live-action comedy. Goodman, the Family Guy showrunner, who had been brought over to run the show, eventually returned to the Family Guy ecosystem in other capacities, and remains a respected veteran in adult animation. None of the people involved had their careers ended by Alan Gregory. The show was bad enough to disappear from the public record, but the people who made it were experienced enough professionally that their reputations survived the disaster intact. The reason this story matters for the larger argument is something specific. Alan Gregory is the clearest evidence that animation domination, by 2011, had become a place where bad shows could be greenlit on the basis of celebrity heat and Family Guy adjacency, regardless of whether the underlying material had any business being on television. The block had been built on Family Guy's success. The network had developed a habit of saying yes to things that resembled Family Guy, things made by Family Guy people, things shaped like Family Guy episodes. The Cleveland show had taught Fox that the formula could be stretched to its limits and still produce 4 seasons. Sit Down, Shut Up had taught Fox that creators from outside the ecosystem could not necessarily save it. Alan Gregory taught Fox something the network apparently did not want to learn, which was that the formula by itself was not enough. A show could check every box on the animation domination template and still be bad enough to be erased from the network's own history. Before we move on, if this analysis is landing for you, think about subscribing. It is a real help to the channel. That lesson sat there, available to be learned, And the next experiment Fox tried in adult animation a few years later would suggest the lesson had not been absorbed at all. The show that came next would have a Family Guy writer at the helm, a celebrity-adjacent voice cast, the same animation studio that had failed with Alan Gregory, and a politically charged premise the network believed would set it apart from the rest of the slate. It would last exactly 13 episodes before being cancelled. Before that show is examined, though, there is a connecting piece worth understanding first. The studio that animated Alan Gregory, Bordertown, and Bob's Burgers, all at the same time, was running a single pipeline that produced wildly different results from wildly similar inputs. The reason why is its own kind of evidence about what was actually going wrong inside the wave. The bento box pipeline. One studio, 3 shows, identical failure mode. The strangest thing about adult animation in the early 2010s is that 3 shows aimed at completely different audiences, with completely different creators, completely different writing rooms, and completely different premises, were all coming out of the same building. That building belonged to a studio called Bento Box Entertainment. Bento Box was founded in 2009 by 3 industry veterans named Scott Greenberg, Joel Kuwahara, and Mark McJimsey. The studio set up shop in Burbank, California, with a sister facility in Atlanta, Georgia, and built itself as a production house that could deliver adult animated comedy on a faster, cheaper, more flexible schedule than the older animation pipelines that had dominated the previous decade. The traditional model for adult animation in America had been to outsource the actual frame-by-frame work to studios in South Korea, with most of the creative work happening in the United States and the labor-intensive drawing happening overseas. Bento Box kept more of the work in-house, used a software-driven approach that allowed for faster turnaround on revisions, and positioned itself as the studio that could take a network's pitch and turn it into finished animation faster than anyone else. By 2011, Bento Box had 3 major shows in active production at the same time. Bob's Burgers, which had launched on Fox in January of that year, Alan Gregory, which had launched in October of that year, and the early development work on Bordertown, which would eventually premiere in 2016. All 3 shows were animated in the same studio by overlapping teams of animators using the same software tools and the same production pipeline. 2 of those 3 shows would become some of the most catastrophic adult animated failures of the entire decade. The third would become one of the most beloved, longest-running, and quietly successful animated comedies of the 2010s and 2020s. Bob's Burgers, as of 2026, has aired over 300 episodes, has spawned a feature film, and is still in production. Alan Gregory was scrubbed from the internet. Bordertown lasted 13 episodes before Fox dumped it into the Sunday 6 o'clock filler slot. The same studio, the same software, the same factory floor. 3 radically different outcomes. This is one of the most useful pieces of evidence in the entire piece about what was actually going wrong with the post-Family Guy adult animation wave, because it removes a variable that critics and audiences kept blaming for these failures. The animation studio was not the problem. The pipeline was not the problem. The software was not the problem. Bento Box was capable of producing a show that ran for 15 years and counting. Bento Box was also capable of producing a show that lasted 7 episodes and got erased from history. The difference between those outcomes lived somewhere else. Bob's Burgers is worth understanding briefly, because its success is what makes the failures around it look so loud. The show was created by Lauren Bouchard, an animator who had spent the previous decade making strange, low-budget, hand-drawn cartoons for Adult Swim and other small outlets. Home Movies, which Bouchard co-created in 1999, had been one of those squiggle animation experiments that found a small but devoted audience. Lucy, the Daughter of the Devil, had been another. Bouchard's whole career had been built on small shows with weird animation styles and a specific kind of warm, character-driven, low-key humor. When Fox approached him to develop a show for prime time, Bouchard brought all of that with him. Bob's Burgers premiered January 9, 2011. It was about a working-class family running a struggling burger restaurant in a coastal town. There was no broad cutaway gag structure. There was no shock humor. There were no political jokes. The pacing was slow by animation domination standards, with whole minutes sometimes given over to small character interactions that did not pay off in punchlines. The early reviews were mixed in a familiar way. Critics noted the slow pacing, the strange voices, the lack of obvious hooks. Several outlets predicted the show would be canceled within a season. The show survived. Audiences found it slowly. The voice cast, which included H. Jon Benjamin as Bob, John Roberts as Linda, Dan Mintz as Tina, Eugene Mirman as Jean, and Kristen Schaal as Louise, had a chemistry that took a few seasons to fully announce itself. By 2013, Bob's Burgers had won its first Primetime Emmy Award. By 2017, it had won a second. The show kept getting renewed, kept finding new viewers, and kept being made by the same bento box pipeline that was simultaneously producing Alan Gregory and developing Border Town. The point worth making here is that everything that worked about Bob's Burgers was a creative decision made before the animation studio ever got involved. Bouchard had a clear sense of what kind of show he was trying to make. He had a writer's room he trusted. He had voice actors he had picked specifically for their unusual voices, which is the opposite of what most animated shows do. He had a worldview about what was funny that did not depend on shock or speed. The bento box pipeline took those creative decisions and rendered them into animated episodes. The studio was a tool. The creative direction was the product. Alan Gregory, made by the same pipeline, had a Family Guy showrunner driving it. Border Town, made by the same pipeline a few years later, had another Family Guy writer driving it. Both shows came in with creative decisions that had been shaped by the animation domination ecosystem rather than by any independent vision. Both shows, when rendered through the same bento box pipeline that was making Bob's Burgers, produced something that looked like Bob's Burgers, technically, but felt nothing like it. The animation could be the same. The studio could be the same. The result depended entirely on what was being fed into the pipeline at the script and design level. There is a specific visual detail about bento box shows worth knowing, because it tells you something about how the studio actually worked. Bento Box used a software approach that emphasized clean, simple character designs with relatively limited animation between frames. This is why Bob's Burgers, Alan Gregory, and Border Town all share a kind of family resemblance in how characters move and how backgrounds are drawn. The cost-effectiveness of this approach is what allowed Bento Box to take on multiple shows at once. The trade-off is that the animation itself does not carry as much expressive weight as the more elaborate hand-drawn work in older animated comedies. Everything depends on the writing, the voice acting, and the design choices made at the start of production. Bob's Burgers makes that trade-off pay off. The character designs are simple, but each character has a distinct visual silhouette and a distinct voice that does the heavy lifting. The animation is limited, but the writing fills in the spaces between frames. The voice acting is so specific and so committed that the show does not need elaborate visual gags to land its jokes. Alan Gregory could not make that trade-off pay off. The character designs were criticized by reviewers for landing in a strange visual middle ground that looked unfinished rather than stylized. The voice acting was inconsistent, with the children in the show particularly criticized for not sounding like children. The writing leaned on shock and discomfort rather than character. None of those things are the studio's fault. All of them are decisions made upstream of the animation pipeline. Border Town, when its time came, would have its own version of this same problem. The writing leaned on political jokes the show did not have the craft to land. The character designs, despite using the same bento box style, were widely criticized as being uglier than they needed to be. The animation was described in reviews as stiff, even by bento box standards. The pipeline was identical to the one making Bob's Burgers in the same building, but the creative inputs were different, and the outputs reflected those differences. The implication of all this is one of the quieter conclusions of this whole piece, but it deserves to be stated plainly. The post-Family Guy adult animation wave kept failing because networks and creators kept assuming you could manufacture a hit by assembling the right surface elements. Get a Family Guy writer, get a celebrity voice, get a recognizable animation studio, get a Sunday night slot, greenlight a show, cross your fingers. The bento box pipeline is the proof that this assembly approach does not work. The same studio, with the same tools, working on overlapping schedules, produced both the longest-running success in the wave and one of its most catastrophic failures. The difference was always upstream. The difference was always in the writing room, in the original vision, in the specific decisions about what kind of show was being made and why. There is a small footnote worth adding about bento box's later history, because it shows how the studio adapted to the changes in the industry. After Alan Gregory and Bordertown, bento box continued to grow. The studio took on additional shows, including The Great North on Fox, Central Park on Apple TV+, and several other animated comedies that came out in the late 2010s and early 2020s. Bob's Burgers continued to be the studio's flagship, and Lorraine Bouchard continued to be the showrunner most closely associated with the bento box brand. The studio never became a name audiences recognized, the way Klasky Shupo or Bagdasarian Productions had been recognizable to earlier generations. But inside the industry, bento box became the studio that could produce reliable, cost-effective adult animation at scale. It still is. The lesson of the bento box pipeline matters for what happens next. 5 years after Alan Gregory was canceled and erased, Fox went back to bento box, partnered them with another Family Guy writer, and tried again. The same network, the same studio, the same animation domination slot. A different premise designed around a politically charged subject the network believed would set the show apart from everything else on the schedule. The show was given full network promotion. It had Seth MacFarlane himself as an executive producer. It had a strong voice cast led by Hank Azaria, the legendary Simpsons voice actor. By every visible measure, it had been set up to succeed. Before we move on, if this analysis is landing for you, think about subscribing. It is a real help to the channel. It lasted 13 episodes. It got pulled from prime time. It was eventually dumped into the 6 o'clock Sunday filler slot and then cancelled. The story of how a show with that much network support, that much industry pedigree, and that much potential in its premise managed to fail so completely is the next piece of this puzzle. Because Bordertown was not a show that failed because nobody was paying attention. Bordertown failed because of decisions made early in development that nobody on the production side was willing to push back on, and those decisions are visible in every single one of the 13 episodes that ever aired. Bordertown, 2016, Fox. The MacFarlane show that tried to have it both ways. The development of Bordertown began in 2013, which is the most important fact about the show, because the show that aired in 2016 was essentially a time capsule from a country that no longer existed by the time the audience saw it. In 2013, the United States was in the middle of a different conversation about immigration than the one it would be having in 2016. President Obama was in his second term. Comprehensive immigration reform was being debated in Congress. The political mood, while still tense, had not yet been reorganized around the campaign of Donald Trump, which would launch in June 2015 and change every previous assumption about how immigration could be talked about in mainstream American culture. A satirical animated comedy about life on the United States and Mexico border, developed in 2013 and pitched in 2014, would have been entering a very different political environment than the one it would actually premiere into. Fox ordered the show that year. Mark Henteman, a longtime writer and executive producer on Family Guy, who had been with that show since its earliest seasons, was named as the creator. Seth MacFarlane attached himself as an executive producer. The Family Guy DNA on the project was direct and deliberate. Bento Box Entertainment, the studio still recovering from the Alan Gregory disaster 2 years earlier, was hired to animate the series. Hank Azaria, the legendary voice actor from The Simpsons who had given the world Apu, Moe, Chief Wiggum, and dozens of other characters, was cast in the lead role. Alex Borstein, the voice of Lois Griffin on Family Guy, was cast in a major supporting part. The voice cast also included Nicholas Gonzalez, Judah Friedlander, Missy Pyle, Jacqueline Pignol, Efrain Ramirez, and Carlos Alazraqui. The premise placed two families next door to each other in a fictional southwestern desert town called Mexifornia, loosely based on the real city of Calexico, California. On one side lived the Buchwald family, headed by Bud Buchwald, a white Border Patrol agent who felt threatened by the demographic changes happening in his neighborhood. On the other side lived the Gonzalez family, headed by Ernesto Gonzalez, a Mexican immigrant who was succeeding economically faster than Bud, despite having been in the United States for less than a decade. The premise had genuine potential. A neighbor comedy across a cultural divide is a setup that has produced some of the best sitcoms in American television history, including All in the Family. Fox tried to do this carefully. The network hired two consulting producers who were genuinely invested in getting the cultural representation right. Lalo Alcaraz, the Mexican-American cartoonist behind the syndicated comic strip La Cucaracha, was brought on board. So was Gustavo Arellano, the journalist and author best known for the column Ask a Mexican. Valentina Garza, who had previously worked on The Simpsons, was named as a supervising producer. The writing room had 13 writers, with Henteman personally writing or co-writing 3 episodes, and Alcaraz co-writing the first 2. By the standards of how American animated television usually handled Latino subject matter, this was a serious attempt to bring real voices into the room. The show premiered January 3, 2016. By that point, the political environment had shifted. Donald Trump had spent 6 months on the campaign trail talking about Mexican immigrants in language that had reframed every previous conversation about the border. Anything a comedy show wanted to say about immigration in January 2016 was going to land in a culture that had become much more polarized, much more raw, and much less interested in nuance than the culture the show had been developed for in 2013. Border Town stepped into that environment. Reviews were generally negative. The Rotten Tomatoes score landed at 35% based on 17 reviews. The Metacritic score came in at 46 out of 100 based on 15 reviews. The critics' consensus on Rotten Tomatoes captured the central problem clearly. The premise of the show was rich with controversy and possibility, the consensus read, but the execution repeatedly mistook crass and desperate gags for actual topical humor. That is the heart of what went wrong. Border Town had been positioned as a show with something to say. The hiring of Alcaraz and Arellano signaled that the producers wanted the show to be informed and respectful. The casting of actual Latino performers in the Latino roles, which was not standard practice for American animated television in 2016, signaled the same thing. The premise itself, two families navigating a cultural divide, suggested the show was going to attempt the kind of comedy that takes a difficult subject seriously while still finding the humor in it. The actual show, episode by episode, kept reaching for cheap jokes instead. Bud Buchwald, the white Border Patrol agent, was written as a one-note bigot whose entire character was his prejudice toward Mexicans. The supporting cast included a recurring villain whose entire purpose was to bully Bud at his job. The show leaned heavily on bodily fluid jokes, gross-out scenes, and the kind of broad shock humor that had been part of the Family Guy formula for years. The character designs, produced through the same bento box pipeline that had produced Alan Gregory, were widely criticized in reviews as being ugly and stiff. The animation moved poorly. The voices, despite the strength of the actors involved, ended up serving material that was beneath their abilities. There is a specific tension inside Bordertown worth pointing out, because it explains a lot about why the show failed. The Family Guy formula, when applied to a topic like immigration, runs into a wall. The cutaway gag rewards speed and disposability. A joke arrives, lands or fails, and is replaced by the next joke 30 seconds later. The audience does not have time to think about what any individual joke is saying. That structure is forgiving when the subject matter is silly. It is unforgiving when the subject matter is real. Bordertown kept making jokes about racism, immigration, deportation, and cultural identity in the same disposable structure Family Guy used to make jokes about Conway Twitty. The structure could not bear the weight of the subject. The result was that every individual joke felt either too heavy for its delivery or too light for its target. The show could not find a register that worked. The consulting producers tried. Alcaraz and Arellano have both spoken in interviews about their work on the show, and both have been clear that they were trying to bring authentic perspective to a project operating inside a structure they did not control. They could push back on individual scripts. They could flag jokes that crossed lines. They could not change the underlying format of the show, which was a Family Guy clone with a Border Patrol premise grafted onto it. The format was the format. Hentemann had been a Family Guy writer for over a decade. Bento Box was the studio. Sunday Night Animation Domination was the slot. The show was always going to be what those inputs added up to. The ratings reflected the show's failure to land. Bordertown averaged a 0.9 rating among adults 18 to 49 and a little over 2 million total viewers, according to Nielsen's 7-day estimates. Those numbers were a ratings bust from the very first week. The show never recovered them. By the time the season was running its final episodes, Fox had moved Bordertown into the 6 o'clock Sunday filler slot, which is the slot networks use when they want to satisfy their contractual obligation to air remaining episodes without devoting any actual primetime real estate to them. On May 12, 2016, 4 months after the show had premiered, Fox canceled Bordertown. The series finale aired May 22, 2016. 13 episodes had been produced. All 13 had aired. The show had lasted exactly 1 season. Variety noted in its cancellation coverage that even with a hit-making executive producer in McFarlane attached, the show had failed to generate any noise in the ratings, which had become the consistent pattern for Fox comedies in those years. The most uncomfortable thing about Bordertown's failure is what it suggested about the limits of the Family Guy formula itself. The Cleveland show had failed because it was a Family Guy clone with a different lead character, and audiences had not connected with the new family setup. Alan Gregory had failed because everything about it was bad. Bordertown failed for a different reason, and a more troubling one. Bordertown failed because the format itself could not handle what it was being asked to do. A serious topic does not get serious treatment in a cutaway gag, dysfunctional family, shock humor structure. The structure flattens everything it touches. It worked on Family Guy because Family Guy was making jokes about nothing in particular. It worked on American Dad because American Dad walked away from the structure and built something else. It did not work on Bordertown because Bordertown wanted to keep the structure and also be about something. Those two ambitions could not coexist. There is a small detail about Bordertown's afterlife worth mentioning. The show is currently available for streaming on Hulu and Disney Plus, and to buy on Fandango at home. Some viewers, particularly people who actually live in border towns, have written warmly about the show in user reviews and online discussions, arguing that Bordertown captured something real about life in those communities that mainstream television had ignored. Those reviews exist. The show was not a complete cultural void. There are people who found something in it the critics missed. But the audience for that something was small, scattered, and never large enough to support the show as a primetime broadcast network production. The lesson Fox should have taken from Bordertown connects directly back to the bento box pipeline analysis from the previous section. The studio was not the problem. The voice cast was not the problem. The cultural consultants were not the problem. The premise was not even the problem. The problem was that Fox kept trying to use the Family Guy formula to make different kinds of shows, and the formula kept refusing to flex. The Cleveland Show, Alan Gregory, Bordertown. 3 shows, 3 different premises, 3 different lead characters, 3 failures that all looked the same from the outside because the structure underneath them was the same structure. And the structure was what kept breaking. By 2016, the animation domination slot had become a graveyard for these experiments. The block survived because The Simpsons, Family Guy, Bob's Burgers, and the other long-running shows kept it on life support. But the new shows the network kept trying to slot in alongside those older series almost all failed. Fox would eventually pause animation domination from 2014 to 2019, replace it with live-action comedies for a while, and only revive it when the network decided to go back to building blocks around Family Guy and the older established hits. Before we move on, if this analysis is landing for you, think about subscribing. It is a real help to the channel. While Fox was learning these lessons the hard way, a completely different network had been running its own experiment with the cutaway gag, shock humor, adult animation formula. Comedy Central, the cable channel that had built its identity around South Park, had decided in 2012 to try its own version of the Family Guy machine. The show was so aggressive in its humor that Fox had passed on the original pilot in 2007 for being too offensive, which is a remarkable thing to be told by the network that aired Family Guy. The show ended up at Comedy Central instead, ran for 3 seasons, and built a cult audience among young men in the 18 to 24 bracket. Its existence is the cleanest evidence in this entire piece that the Family Guy formula, when stripped of broadcast network restrictions, became something even louder, even cruder, and even harder to defend than the show it was copying. Brickleberry, 2012 to 2014, Comedy Central. The show Fox rejected for being too offensive. The most useful single fact about Brickleberry is that Fox, the network that had been airing Family Guy for years and would soon air Bordertown without flinching, looked at the Brickleberry pilot in 2007 and decided it was too offensive to put on television. That decision is one of the most revealing moments in the entire history of post-Family Guy adult animation, because it tells you something about the formula. The formula itself never wanted you to know. There was a line. Fox had a line. The line was somewhere past Family Guy and somewhere short of whatever Brickleberry was trying to be. The fact that the line existed meant the network's appetite for shock humor, which had seemed limitless from the outside, actually had a ceiling. The fact that Brickleberry had managed to find that ceiling on its first attempt at a pilot meant something was happening in the show's writing that even the producers of the most controversial animated comedy on broadcast television had decided was too much. The story of how Brickleberry got made starts with 2 men named Waco Ogan and Roger Black. They had met at the University of Georgia in 1999 and had been making comedy together ever since. Their early work was a touring underground stage show called The Damn Show, the kind of touring sketch comedy that traveled to college towns and small clubs across the South, building a cult following among college students who wanted comedy mainstream television would not air. The Damn Show was deliberately offensive. The whole point of it was to be deliberately offensive. O'Ginn and Black built characters there, including a recurring character named Bobby Possum Cods, that they would later move directly into Brickleberry without changing. In 2005, MTV2 picked up an animated version of their work called Stanker Vision. The show lasted 2 seasons and was cancelled. After that cancellation, Ogin and Black began developing a new project. The idea came from Ogin's father-in-law, a real-life retired Yellowstone Park ranger named Woody, who took his job extremely seriously. The 2 writers found his commitment hilarious and started building a comedy around the premise of a national park staffed by terrible park rangers. They originally pitched it as a live-action show, but budget concerns pushed them toward animation. Fox ordered a pilot in 2007. Then, Fox passed. The reason Fox passed is the part that matters. The network found the material too offensive, even by the standards of a network airing Family Guy at the time. The exact details of what was in the original pilot have not been made fully public, but the show that eventually made it to air on Comedy Central in 2012 built extended jokes out of the most taboo subjects broadcast television refuses to host: sexual violence, disease, race, and other material of that kind. The implication is that the 2007 Fox pilot contained material in roughly the same register, and Fox decided broadcast television could not host it. Ogin and Black sat with the rejection. Their agent at William Morris Agency eventually connected them with Daniel Tosh, the comedian who was rapidly becoming one of the biggest names at Comedy Central thanks to his clip show, Tosh. Zero. Tosh was at the height of his industry leverage at that point. His stand-up tour was selling out nationwide. Tosh. Zero was one of the highest-rated programs on cable. He was looking for projects to attach his name to that would extend his presence on the network beyond his own show. He read Brickleberry, liked what Ogwyn and Black were doing, and signed on as an executive producer. He also took the role of Malloy, a foul-mouthed bear cub who became one of the show's central characters. That was the deal that got Brickleberry on the air. Comedy Central greenlit the show. It premiered September 25, 2012, in the time slot directly after Tosh. Zero on Tuesday nights. The voice cast included David Herman as Steve, the dim-witted lead ranger, Tom Kenny as Woody, the violent park supervisor, Roger Black voicing himself in a recurring role, Jerry Minor as Denzel, the cynical ranger, Natasha Leggero as Ethel, the deeply troubled new ranger, and Tosh as Malloy. The show ran for 3 seasons, 36 episodes total. It was canceled by Comedy Central on January 7, 2015. The reception is where Brickleberry gets interesting, because the standard pattern for shows like this would be to expect bad reviews and small audiences. Brickleberry got the bad reviews. It did not get small audiences. In its first season, the show averaged 1.9 million viewers per week, with particularly strong performance among men aged 18 to 24. In its second season, it averaged 1.6 million viewers per week and was the #1 program in all of television in its time slot among men aged 18 to 24. Those numbers, in cable terms, are real numbers. The show was finding an audience. The audience it was finding was specific. Young men, heavy Tosh. Zero viewers, the kind of audience that had grown up on Family Guy in the 2000s and had aged into a desire for something even louder, even cruder, and even less concerned with broadcast network limits. Brickleberry gave that audience exactly what it wanted. The show leaned into every taboo Fox had refused to host: cartoon nudity, drug use, constant racial humor, sexual violence played for laughs, animal cruelty as a recurring gag. The show had no interest in being defensible. Its entire identity was built around being indefensible. The critical response was almost uniformly negative. Reviews described the show as juvenile, mean-spirited, lazy, and reliant on shock for its own sake. Some critics defended individual moments. most did not. The show was widely treated in the press at the time as a low point in adult animation, rather than any kind of genuine creative achievement. What is interesting about Brickleberry, viewed in the larger context of this piece, is that it is the cleanest possible test of one specific theory about why Family Guy worked. The theory goes like this: Family Guy works because of permission. The show grants itself permission to make jokes about anything, and the audience responds to that permission as a kind of comedic freedom. If that theory were true, then a show that took the same permission and pushed it even further should work even better. More permission, more comedy, more audience. Brickleberry took that bet. It pushed the permission past every line Family Guy had been willing to cross. It put more shock per minute on screen than any major animated show before or since. And it failed. Not commercially in its target demographic, where it succeeded, but critically and culturally, where it became one of the most poorly regarded adult animated shows of the entire 2010s. That gap matters. Brickleberry proved that more permission did not equal more value. The audience that wanted pure shock found the show. The audience that wanted comedy with any kind of weight or surprise did not. The show became a niche product for a specific demographic rather than a crossover hit. It never broke out of its Tuesday night, after Tosh, zero slot. It never developed the kind of cultural footprint Family Guy had. The merchandise was minimal. The cultural conversation around it was almost non-existent outside its core audience. When Comedy Central canceled the show in January 2015, the network announced the decision quietly. There was no public goodbye, no retrospective, no syndication push. The show simply ended. Ogin, Black, and Tosh moved on to other projects. The cast scattered. By 2017, the show had turned up in dishonorable mentions lists of worst cancelled cartoons on YouTube, which is a strange kind of cultural afterlife to have. There is a wrinkle in the Brickleberry story that connects it forward to the Netflix era of adult animation, and it is worth setting up here for the next section. After the cancellation, Ogin and Black were not done with the formula they had built. They had a voice cast that worked together. They had a comedic register they understood. They had access to characters that fans of the show had connected with. They needed a network that would let them keep making the same kind of show. By 2018, that network would be Netflix. But before getting there is one more piece of the Brickleberry story that has to be mentioned, because it tells you something specific about what was happening to American adult animation in the 2000s and 2010s. In a 2023 interview with Rolling Stone, Ogin offered a theory about why Brickleberry and its successor projects had not been pulled into the kind of cancel culture controversies other shows had faced. His theory was that audiences put their work in the same mental category as South Park, with the assumption that the creators were too far gone to be reformed, and that the smartest move was to ignore them rather than try to fix them. Ogin's framing was that more normal shows that did something just slightly crazy got cancelled, while shows like his did insane things and slipped under the radar specifically because their entire identity was built on those insane things. That theory is worth examining because it captures something true about the post-Family Guy adult animation landscape that nobody else in the industry has stated as plainly. There was a kind of comedy audiences had decided not to engage with critically. The decision was not that the comedy was acceptable. The decision was that arguing about the comedy was not worth the effort. Brickleberry, Paradise PD, and the shows that followed them existed inside that protected zone. The protection was real. It was also a sign that the shows had become culturally invisible. A show nobody is bothering to argue about is a show nobody is paying attention to in any meaningful way. This invisibility is what separates Brickleberry from a show like Family Guy in the long run. Family Guy still gets argued about. Family Guy still appears in cultural commentary, in essays about animation, in jokes by other comedians, in academic papers about adult cartoons. Brickleberry shows up in lists of worst cancelled cartoons and in threads about shows people forgot existed. The two paths look similar from the outside. The destinations are completely different. The Comedy Central ecosystem Brickleberry came out of was an ecosystem with rules. There was a budget ceiling. There was a runtime per episode that had to be left clear for commercials. There was a basic cable standards and practices department, looser than broadcast, but still a department. There were limits on how long the show could push any single joke before it needed to be censored or trimmed. The Brickleberry creators worked inside those limits for 3 seasons, and even inside those limits, they were producing a show that pushed past what Fox had been willing to host 5 years earlier. Before we move on, if this analysis is landing for you, think about subscribing. It is a real help to the channel. When the same creators got the chance to work without those limits a few years later, they took it. The streaming era version of Brickleberry would arrive on Netflix in 2018 with no commercial breaks, no broadcast standards, no runtime restrictions, and no network notes about what could and could not be shown on screen. The result is one of the most extreme cases of the cutaway gag, shock humor formula ever produced, made by the same creators with the same voice cast, dropped onto a streaming service that algorithmically decides whether to keep recommending it. Whether that experiment worked, and what happened to it when Netflix eventually decided it had run its course, is the next piece of this puzzle. But before the streaming era, there is one more broadcast-era ripoff that deserves examination, and it comes from a country and a network almost nobody outside of Canada has ever thought about as a contributor to the Family Guy wave. Crash Canyon, 2011 to 2013, Teletoon. The Canadian Family Guy ripoff most people never heard of. Canada has a particular relationship with American television that does not get talked about enough. For most of the late 20th century, Canadian broadcasters were required by their own government to air a certain amount of Canadian-produced content during prime-time hours. The rule existed to protect Canadian culture from being completely overwhelmed by American programming, which had a much bigger budget, a much bigger star pool, and a much bigger marketing engine. The result was that Canadian networks were constantly scrambling to produce shows that could fill those Canadian content quotas while still feeling compelling enough that Canadian audiences would watch them, rather than just changing the channel to whatever American show was on at the same time. In adult animation specifically, this created a recurring pattern. American shows like Family Guy, The Simpsons, and South Park would become hits in Canada through licensing deals, and Canadian networks would then commission their own animated comedies built to a similar template, hoping that audiences who liked the American versions would also watch a domestic one. Some of these shows were genuinely good. Clone High, which ran on Teletoon and MTV in 2002, became a small cult classic. The Dating Guy, Sons of Butcher, and Undergrads all had their own runs and their own fans. Most of these shows were aimed at young adults, aired in late-night blocks, and used the Canadian content rules as a reason to exist that the marketplace alone might not have provided. Crash Canyon was one of those shows. The series was created by Jamie Leclerc, Phil Lafrance, and Kyle McDougall, a trio of Canadian animators who had founded a small studio called Jam-Filled Entertainment. They partnered with Breakthrough Entertainment, a larger Canadian production company, and developed the show specifically for Teletoon at Night, a late-night programming block on the Canadian Teletoon channel designed to mirror what Adult Swim had been doing in the United States. The development of the show was led by a Canadian-born writer named Joel H. Cohen, who at the time was a working writer on The Simpsons in Los Angeles. Cohen had been a Canadian expatriate for years, and he reportedly told the production team that he wanted to make a show with other Canadian writers living in Los Angeles, so they could write jokes only Canadians would get. He recruited Tim Long, another Simpsons writer, and Chuck Tatham, a writer from How I Met Your Mother. both of them Canadian expatriates working in American television. The premise of Crash Canyon is one of the strangest in the entire wave. A dysfunctional family called the Wendells goes on a caravan vacation through Alberta, Canada, and accidentally drives off a cliff into a 2-mile deep canyon. The canyon walls are too high to climb. There is no way out. When the family lands at the bottom, they discover that around 30 other people are already living there, all of them survivors of previous crashes from earlier decades, all of them stranded together, all of them having built a small functioning community at the bottom of the pit. Dollars are not accepted as currency. They use golf tees instead. The community is held together by a wealthy family called the Vanderbilts, who control most of the resources at the bottom of the canyon. The Wendells must learn to adapt to this strange little society while occasionally attempting, and failing, to escape. The setup is closer to Gilligan's Island than to Family Guy at the structural level. The trapped community premise is the kind of high-concept setup that would have lent itself to a serialized story. The early episodes hinted at deeper mythology, with hints about previous crashes and earlier residents of the canyon, including an 1800s bank robber named Robin Banks, who had hidden in the canyon with a monkey and a donkey before dying in a fire ant hill. But the actual execution of Crash Canyon, episode by episode, was not Gilligan's Island. It was Family Guy transposed to a Canadian setting with the cutaway gag as its primary engine. The reviews of the show, the few that exist, are unusually pointed about this. The show has been described in fan reviews and online retrospectives as trying so hard to be Canada's Family Guy that the effort becomes distracting. The cutaway gags are the same kind of cutaway gags Family Guy used. Some viewers in online discussions have argued that specific cutaway jokes in Crash Canyon were essentially copies of jokes that had appeared in Family Guy episodes a few years earlier. The dysfunctional family setup at the show's core, with a buffoonish father, a patient mother, and stereotyped children, mirrored the Family Guy template almost beat for beat. The pacing of the comedy, with rapid-fire jokes interrupted by musical cues that signaled to the audience when to laugh, was lifted directly from the same playbook. The character roster reflected the same approach. The lead family, the Wendells, included Norm, a buttoned-up, rational father who could not get angry, Sheila, his easily enraged wife, Roxy, a teenage daughter, and Jake, a younger son. Around them lived a collection of stranded canyon residents who served as the supporting cast. There was Sid, a former British punk rocker whose only hit song had been called "I Want to Punch a Rainbow." There were Bobby and Bodine, two redneck brothers who lived in the canyon and were dim-witted in ways the show treated as a recurring joke. There was Frida Dominguez, a Latina restaurant owner whose hygiene standards were terrible, and an Indian-Canadian ventriloquist who treated his dummy like a real person. There was Pete and Carol, two ambulance attendants who treated their permanently comatose patient as an object. The supporting cast was built almost entirely from broad ethnic and regional stereotypes, the same way Family Guy had populated Quahog with broad versions of various character types. The show premiered September 18, 2011, on Teletoon at night. 26 episodes were produced across 2 seasons. The first season ran 18 episodes. The second ran 8. The final episode aired March 3, 2013. On June 6, 2013, Teletoon released a brief press statement saying the network would not be moving forward with a 3rd season of the series. The exact words were that a 3rd season was not in the network's plans at this time. Internationally, the show was distributed by MTV, which carried it to dozens of countries, including the United States, where it aired on a small cable channel called MAV TV. Most American viewers would never have encountered Crash Canyon during its original run, unless they happened to be channel surfing late at night and stumbled onto a network they did not recognize. The show simply did not have the marketing budget to become known in the United States, which was the country whose adult animation tradition had created it in the first place. The reception during its run was harsh in a specific way. IMDb users who reviewed the show during its broadcast described it as a poorly made copy of an American template with stiff animation, predictable plots, and what one reviewer called annoyingly awful voice acting. Several reviewers specifically noted that the show seemed to be trying to ride the coattails of having a Simpsons writer involved in development, but that the connection had not produced the comedic quality the credit implied. Other reviewers were more sympathetic, noting that the show found a small but dedicated audience in Canada, and that the late seasons showed signs of finding a stronger voice as the writers got more comfortable with their cast. What makes Crash Canyon worth examining for this piece, despite the show's small footprint, is what it proves about the global reach of the Family Guy formula by 2011. The cutaway gag, dysfunctional family, shock comedy template had become a template creators in other countries could apply to their own settings, hoping to capture some portion of the audience the American original had built up. Canadian creators were not alone in this. Australian, British, and German networks all attempted similar formats during the same period, with similar results. The Family Guy machine had become a globally exportable product, the same way American sitcom formats had been exported in earlier decades. Networks in foreign countries were licensing the shape of the show, swapping in their own local references, and hoping to produce something that would fill their own prime-time hours. The thing almost none of those international attempts captured was the part of Family Guy that was actually working. They captured the cutaway gag. They captured the dysfunctional family. They captured the willingness to push past good taste. They missed the engine underneath, which was the specific writer's room culture and the specific creative voice Seth MacFarlane had built over a decade. Crash Canyon's writer's room was 3 Canadian expatriates working in Los Angeles, separated by thousands of miles from the Canadian production team actually animating the show. The disconnect showed up in the final product. The jokes felt manufactured rather than felt. The premise felt like a setup rather than a world. The characters felt like job descriptions rather than people. That is the central limitation of every show in this piece in some form. The Family Guy formula is not a set of structural elements that can be assembled by a competent writer's room. The formula is a byproduct of a specific creative voice operating inside a specific writer's room. Take the elements without the voice, and you get an empty shell. Crash Canyon is one of the cleanest examples of that empty shell, because the show had every visible element on the checklist and almost nothing underneath those elements that made them work. There is one detail about Crash Canyon's production that captures the larger international story even more clearly. The international distribution rights were handled by MTV, which had previously been the distribution partner on 2 earlier Teletoon adult animation projects, the cult classic series Clone High and the college-themed cartoon Undergrads. Both of those earlier shows had been creatively distinctive in their own ways. Clone High had a sharp, specific writing voice and built genuine cult appeal. Undergrads had a small but devoted college audience. Crash Canyon was the third in this lineage, and the difference between it and its predecessors is what makes the comparison instructive. By 2011, when Crash Canyon was being made, the model for international adult animation distribution had become standardized in a way it had not been a decade earlier. The shows were being made to fit a template rather than being made on their own terms and then finding international distribution after the fact. That standardization is the larger point. By 2011, the Family Guy wave had become so commercially established that even shows being made in other countries, by other production companies, with other broadcasting partners, were defaulting to the same formula. The formula had become the safe choice for adult animation worldwide. Networks were no longer asking what kind of adult animation they wanted to make. They were asking how closely they could approximate Family Guy without being sued for outright copying it. That is the worst possible creative environment for actually making a good show, and the results across the entire international wave reflect that environment. Teletoon itself would eventually meet a fate similar to many of the shows it had aired. In February 2023, the parent company of Teletoon, Chorus Entertainment, announced that the channel was being shut down and rebranded as the Canadian version of Cartoon Network. After more than 25 years on the air, Teletoon as a brand ceased to exist on March 27, 2023. The late-night block that had hosted Crash Canyon, along with Clone High, Undergrads, Robot Chicken, and dozens of other adult animation imports and originals, was absorbed into a different network identity. The infrastructure that had made shows like Crash Canyon possible no longer existed in the form it had taken in the 2000s. Before we move on, if this analysis is landing for you, think about subscribing. It is a real help to the channel. What this whole story sets up is the question of where adult animation went next, after broadcast and basic cable had both stopped being reliable homes for the Family Guy formula. The answer turned out to be streaming. Netflix, the company that had built itself into the dominant force in American television viewing by the late 2010s, had spent years acquiring rights to existing adult animated shows and watching their streaming numbers carefully. By 2018, the company was ready to start commissioning original adult animated comedies. The first major project it greenlit came from the same two creators who had spent the previous decade making Brickleberry on Comedy Central, with most of the same voice cast doing essentially the same kind of show with the streaming era restrictions removed. The result is the show that pushes the Family Guy formula to its absolute limit, and the one that finally proves what the limit actually is. Paradise PD, 2018 to 2022, Netflix. The streaming era's final cutaway gag holdout. When Comedy Central canceled Brickleberry in January 2015, Waco Ogin and Roger Black had a problem almost every canceled adult animation creator faces. They had built a creative team, a voice cast, a comedic register, and a working set of characters, and now they had no network to put any of it on. The infrastructure they had built was sitting idle. The actors they had worked with were available. The animation contacts they had developed were waiting for the next project. And the formula they had been pushing for 3 years on Comedy Central, the cutaway gag, shock humor adult animation template that traced back to Family Guy, had not yet found its absolute limit. What Ogin and Black needed was a network that would let them keep going. The broadcast networks had become hostile territory for new adult animation. By the mid-2010s, Fox had pulled back from launching new shows in the animation domination block. ABC had given up on adult animation entirely after The Good Family failed in 2009. NBC had never been a meaningful player in the genre. CBS had stayed away from the format altogether. Comedy Central, which had just canceled them, was unlikely to reverse course. The old homes were closing. The new home was streaming. By 2017, Netflix had become the dominant force in how Americans watch television. The company had spent the previous several years building its streaming library by licensing shows from broadcast and cable networks, and it had been watching the streaming numbers on those licensed shows carefully. Adult animation, the company found, performed well on streaming. Subscribers would watch 4 or 5 episodes in a row late at night. Old episodes of Family Guy and American Dad and Bob's Burgers ranked consistently in the top viewing categories on the platform. The genre seemed to fit what streaming was naturally good at. People wanted something to put on while they cooked dinner, while they fell asleep, while they did the dishes. Adult animation filled that need better than almost any other format. So Netflix started commissioning its own. On April 4, 2018, Netflix announced a straight-to-series order for 10 episodes of a show called Paradise PD, created by Ogin and Black, animated by Bento Box Entertainment in partnership with a production company called Odenkirk Provisiero Entertainment. The voice cast included Tom Kenny, David Herman, Sarah Chalky, Cedric Yarbrough, Dana Snyder, Kyle Kinane, and Roger Black himself. 6 of the 7 main cast members had been part of Brickleberry. The premise was deliberately a mirror image of the previous show. Where Brickleberry had been about incompetent park rangers, Paradise PD was about incompetent small-town police officers. The setting was different. The character archetypes were identical. The show premiered on Netflix on August 31st, 2018. The Brickleberry connection was so direct the show could barely pretend otherwise. Reviewers and viewers picked it up immediately. Online discussions of Paradise PD almost universally described the show as Brickleberry with a different uniform. Chief Randall Crawford, voiced by Tom Kenny, was Woody Johnson from Brickleberry with a different name and a different mustache. Kevin Crawford, voiced by David Herman, was Steve Williams from Brickleberry with a different last name. Bullet, the talking police dog, voiced by Kyle Kinane, was Malloy the bear from Brickleberry, transposed into a different species. The other main cast members each had a corresponding character in the previous show, and every reviewer who had watched both shows could draw the connections explicitly. The show eventually acknowledged this connection. In Season 2, Episode 7, the show featured a crossover with Brickleberry. The Paradise PD characters traveled to Brickleberry National Park and met the Rangers from the older series. The episode was framed as a deliberate joke about how similar the two shows were. At one point, a Brickleberry character called the Paradise PD lead, Kevin, a Brickleberry-looking Kevin, then broke the fourth wall to deny the two shows were similar, listed the differences between police officers and park rangers as proof, and immediately addressed his Brickleberry counterpart by the wrong name, undercutting his own argument. In another moment, the Brickleberry characters acknowledged that this was probably the last time anyone would ever see them. That self-awareness is part of what makes Paradise PD a useful subject for this section. The show knew exactly what it was. It knew it was repeating a formula. It knew the formula traced back through Brickleberry to Family Guy. It knew its own audience knew. The show stopped pretending it was original, and instead leaned into being a continuation, the way a band on its third album stops trying to surprise its fans and just gives them what they came for. The streaming era restrictions were the part that was different. On Netflix, there were no commercial breaks. Episodes ran longer than they had on Comedy Central. There were no broadcast standards and practices departments to flag specific jokes. There were no advertisers to worry about offending. The cursing was uncensored. The nudity was uncensored. The drug use was explicit. The violence was extreme. The show used this freedom in exactly the way O'Gin and Black had been signaling for years they would use it if given the chance. The result was a show that took the Brickleberry formula and pushed it past every limit basic cable had imposed. The reception split exactly along the lines you would expect. Fans of Brickleberry mostly enjoyed Paradise PD. They were the target audience, and the show delivered what they wanted. Critics outside that fan base were largely hostile, with reviews describing the show as juvenile, lazy, and almost completely free of any reason to exist beyond the comfort of repeating jokes the same audience had already heard before. The show did consistently appear in Netflix's top 10 TV shows list across more than 20 countries during its run, which suggests that whatever criticism it received from professional reviewers, it was finding viewers in real numbers around the world. The show ran for 4 parts. Netflix had moved away from calling its seasons by this point and had started calling them parts instead, partly to distinguish streaming releases from traditional broadcast seasons. Part 1, 10 episodes, released August 31st, 2018. Part 2, 8 episodes, released March 6th, 2020. Part 3, 12 episodes, released March 12th, 2021. Part 4, 10 episodes, released December 16th, 2022. 40 episodes total across 4 years. Then, Netflix canceled it. The cancellation was announced in June 2022 before Part 4 had even released. There would be no Part 5. The streaming model that had seemed so welcoming to adult animation in 2018 had begun to tighten. Netflix had been on a years-long expansion through the late 2010s, greenlighting more shows than it could reasonably continue to support, and by the early 2020s, the company was beginning the contraction phase that would eventually become known in the industry as the Great Netflix Purge. Shows with smaller audiences were being canceled. Shows with mid-sized audiences were being canceled. Even some shows with strong audiences were being canceled if their cost-per-viewer ratio did not meet new internal thresholds. Paradise PD fell into that broader pattern. Ogin and Black were not done. Even before Paradise PD ended, they had launched a new project on Netflix called Farzar, a science fiction adult animated comedy with a similar comedic register and an overlapping voice cast. Farzar premiered on July 7, 2022. It was cancelled after one season, released in August 2023. The pattern was complete. The same creators, the same approach, the same Netflix algorithm that had welcomed them in 2018 and pushed them out by 2023. There is a final piece to this story that connects forward to the present moment. After Netflix canceled both shows, Ogwin and Black moved their projects to a new format entirely. In 2025, they launched a Kickstarter campaign to produce a graphic novel called Paradise PD and Farzar, the final season. The campaign promised an explosive crossover uniting the characters from both shows, picking up after the events that ended each series. The campaign reached full funding within weeks. Stretch goals unlocked additional pages featuring Brickleberry characters. By 2025, the cutaway gag, shock humor formula Ogin and Black had been making for over a decade had moved from broadcast to cable to streaming to crowdfunded comic book, each platform smaller than the one before, each with a more dedicated and specific audience. That progression tells the larger story of what happened to the Family Guy formula in the streaming era. The shows that imitated Family Guy in the 2000s and 2010s had ridden the wave of broadcast television's last era of dominance. When that era ended, the formula moved to streaming, briefly thrived there, and then shrank as streaming itself stopped greenlighting new adult animation at the rate it once had. Each new platform was smaller than the one before. Each new platform had a more specific audience. The mass-market adult animation hit that Family Guy had been in 1999 and that imitators had been chasing for 2 decades had become, by the mid-2020s, a niche product for niche audiences, kept alive on Kickstarter pages and in online communities rather than in primetime broadcast slots. What Paradise PD proves more clearly than any other show in this piece is that the Family Guy formula has a hard limit. The limit is not in the writing room. The limit is not in the studio. The limit is not in the network's willingness to host the material. The limit is in how much shock comedy an audience will absorb before the audience itself decides the format has been exhausted. Brickleberry pushed the limit on basic cable. Paradise PD pushed the limit on streaming. Both shows found their core audience. Neither show grew that audience. Neither show became a crossover hit. The audience that wanted exactly what these shows offered was the same audience watching the same kind of jokes year after year in different settings with different uniforms. Compare that to Family Guy in 2026. Family Guy is in its 23rd season. American Dad is returning to Fox for its 22nd season. Both shows have outlasted every imitator covered in this piece. Both have done so by being capable of growing past their original audiences while keeping their core audience. Family Guy still picks up new viewers in their teens every year. American Dad still finds new fans on streaming services. Neither show has the problem the imitators have, which is that the imitators are stuck delivering the same product to the same audience over and over until the audience ages out or moves on. The Family Guy formula, viewed from the 2026 vantage point, turns out to be something more specific than the imitators ever realized. It was not a set of structural choices that could be reverse engineered. It was a single creative voice operating inside a single network ecosystem at a particular cultural moment. And the surface elements of that show, the cutaway gag, the dysfunctional family, the shock humor, were the visible expression of something underneath that nobody managed to copy, because nobody managed to articulate it clearly enough to copy. The shows in this piece are evidence of that in different ways. The Cleveland show had every advantage the formula could provide and still failed within 4 seasons. Sit Down, Shut Up had a creator from outside the formula and was killed in 4 episodes. Alan Gregory had a celebrity star and was scrubbed from the internet. Bordertown had cultural consultants and political ambition and lasted 13 episodes. Brickleberry pushed the formula to a basic cable limit and ran 3 seasons. Crash Canyon exported the formula to another country and lasted 26 episodes. Paradise PD took the formula to streaming and lasted 40 episodes. Family Guy itself, the show all of these shows were either copying directly or responding to indirectly, has produced over 400 episodes and shows no sign of stopping. American Dad, the one McFarlane follow-up that walked away from the formula, has produced over 400 episodes and also shows no sign of stopping. The 2 shows that thrived are the original and the one that refused to be a copy. Everything in between is a graveyard. That graveyard is what this piece has walked through. Several hours of quiet exploration into why so many shows tried so hard to be one specific show and almost none of them succeeded. The reason cuts deeper than animation pipelines or network politics or cultural moments. The reason is that originality cannot be reverse engineered, and the people who tried to reverse engineer Family Guy spent 15 years proving exactly that, one canceled show at a time. The shows piled up, the audiences moved on, the formula kept failing, the original kept running. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe.